The first thing I want to ask you guys about is you've made this really wonderful film that's about science. It's about the way science affects people's lives. It's about the way people can affect science lives. But I feel like this movie also has just the tiniest bit of magic in it. That this is a movie that also is about two people with the same passion, the same goals in life, happening to grow up in the same small town. And it made me wonder, do the two of you believe in fate at all?
That's such a great question. That might be one of my favorite questions I think we've ever gotten. So just thank you for those kind words, and thank you for that question. Stories like this make me question fate and relate to fate in a profoundly different way than I ever have before. I can't say that I necessarily believe in it, but I believe when you pursue something that feels like your authentic truth, and when you live your life in a way where meaning is at the very center of it, it might feel like fate because you're doing what you dream of doing. It's what enriches your life. And for Katia and Maurice, that was the pursuit of volcanoes, this grand mystery, which of course mystery and magic go hand in hand. And it was being in love with each other and with the earth. So in that way, it's almost like there's a fated quality to that. But I feel like it was something that was not a choice for them because they loved it so much. That's how they had to live. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I believe that there's a cause behind the cause behind the cause of all things, and we live in the concatenation of all things. But I at the same time, I think it's beyond our understanding. That what appears to be the truth that I'm able to touch is that it's mysterious, and the reason why something happens may be ordained or destined or fated, but it's beyond my comprehension. But that complex, the contradiction of that is what makes things interesting, and what makes, I think, was what made Maurice and Katia want to always strive to touch what seemed impossible to do any other way, or to live in a way where there was no other choice but to live as you felt you had to.
But other than, I mean, kind of on that note, like you pointed out, that there's, it feels like they are drawn to this idea of mystery. And I think that's fascinating that you two are documentary filmmakers making a film about people who also were, in a way, documentary filmmakers, documenting their experience, making films to fund their work. And they definitely seem to believe in some sort of mystery, to make peace with mystery, which I feel like there are two kind of schools of thought in documentary. Some people are like, I must get to the truth. And some people are like, the world is a little bit mysterious. Where do you guys fall on that spectrum?
That's a great question. I would say I think for Katia and Maurice, I feel like the truth is mystery in a way. Like those two things are joined together. I feel like with them, they understood the ultimate unrequitedness of being human. Of they were in pursuit of this geologic force that was so beyond human understanding, which in their own words. But going towards that, trying to understand it, brought them a higher sense of truth and kind of a feeling of the divine, even though they didn't use religious terminology themselves. So in that way, yeah, I feel like there was a truth quality to that purity of their pursuit that at once was all about mystery. And that's something that I feel so inspired by them, and it's been such a joy to get to be immersed in their lives that I'm a disciple of Katia and Maurice. I worship at their volcano temple. So I would probably consider myself in that camp as well. How about you?
He's worried about getting yelled at about the microphone again.
I can give you 2 mics.
But I think all of us here now feel so close to Katia and Maurice, having seen this film, two people that we'll never get to meet, that we'll never have a chance to meet. And, you have spent so much time with them, going through all of this footage, 250 hours, I think, altogether. As your interpreters of Katia and Maurice, when did the two of you decide to represent them as Katia is a bird and Maurice is an elephant seal?
You're asking such great questions. These are really making me smile because I feel like you're seeing into like so many of the things that we spent so much room talking about in the edit room. Do you want to take this one? Or you want? Yeah. Okay, I'll start. Please chime in. Katia is a bird. Maurice is an elephant seal. Was actually extremely early on in our process. The footage, as you said, we were working with about 250 hours. There's about 200 hours of 16mm footage that Katia and Maurice shot. And then there's about 50 hours of footage that was them on television programs and largely Francophone Western Europe, documentaries that other people had made. The 16mm footage had no sound, and it was absolutely spectacular, but also extremely difficult to work with. Aside from lacking sound, it was like, 2 seconds of one shot, 5 seconds of another shot, 10 seconds of something that made absolutely no sense, that had nothing to do with volcanoes whatsoever. So the editorial process was quite difficult, but it was also really special. But basically, we're working with these kinds of materials. Sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought because I'm thinking about the footage. Help me out here. Where am I going with this?
I don't know where you're going, but I can jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
No,
I'm going to come back to it.
I think one of the things that's interesting about that, the distinction.
Yes.
Go for it.
No, go for it.
The distinction between Maurice and Katia, there's something in a love affair where you enter into a place of oneness, of togetherness, but there's also the importance of differentiation. And I think for them, we learned so much about them as a unit through understanding them as different beings with different purposes, different hopes, ideals, priorities. And through their individual priorities, you got to see the relationship between them and how they were able to unify them in a sort of love affair and in a pursuit of something that was beyond what they could do as a unit together, and certainly what they could do as differentiated beings.
Well, and you kind of captured them. You capture that in the film. They also there's Katia and Maurice, and then there's Katia and Maurice, the people performing the act of being scientists on a camera. And there's kind of a distinction between those two things. But I'm wondering, when you're just looking at these tiny snippets of film, how could you tell when you're seeing the authentic crafts and the stage managed crafts?
That's a great question, and I remembered what I meant to say, so thank you for bearing with me. But in those shards of footage that we're looking at, there is gorgeous imagery of Katia playing with the birds, and then there is footage of Maurice beckoning and challenging these elephant seals, and each of them instantly made us think, like, these feel like kind of a crystallization of their personalities in a way, and we decided to experiment with them. And the more we learned about them, the more that was confirmed, so much so that in their obituary, one of their dear friends wrote about how Katia was a pilotfish and Maurice was a whale following her. And pilotfish and whale are quite different, but at the same time, there's an essential character that's similar. And that's really what I felt like kind of our process of learning about them was like. There was initial interpretations where we would try to intuit something from the footage, and have to question, is this them, enacting performativity, displaying their characters for the camera, or is this really who they are? But we realized that they always were actually enacting versions of themselves. They weren't inauthentic, but they realized the savviness of their performativity and how that could interest people in the science of volcanology, how it could bring people to love the earth. So there's a lot of utility in doing that. And it was really interesting. The more people we talked to, the more we learned about them, the more those things got to be confirmed.
Yeah, they were storytellers as scientists, they were storytellers as filmmakers, and then they were storytellers as human beings and as performers of themselves.
What do you make of Maurice as a cinematographer? I mean, I will say he does seem to have a thing about zooming into people's butts.
Yeah, there's some really funny footage, actually. He had a really good sense of humor in terms of framing. I think that Maurice and Katia too, were so in love with the earth, and that drew them to find the most kind of beautiful and interesting ways of lensing the earth. I feel like their frame always captured a sense of sentience, particularly. The earth always felt so alive. I remember some of the first footage we ever came into contact with were these close-ups of lava in Hawaii, where it really does look like this oozing, breathing, kind of monstrous beast that you can't help but be so entranced by. But when you really think about the techniques of this, he must have been leaning over this incredibly hot earth. And so the sacrifice that went into it. But you're right, they were actually, seemed to be very influenced by the French New Wave, and many kind of aesthetics of that movement show up in for example, Maurice's cinematography, like the snap zooms. So that was really fun for us to not just play with in our own editing, but it also kind of taught us, okay, this is something that was meaningful to them. Let's embrace that in our own storytelling. Let's kind of adapt some of the other kind of, the signs of the French New Wave. So that's fun for us.
But the butt zooms were also part of their aesthetic, but also part of their philosophy. They were deeply immersed in existentialism, and what became obvious in getting to go on this journey with Maurice and Katia was that they understood that the world had the absurd inside of every fabric of it, and you couldn't engage in a serious pursuit without also being playful and without also recognizing the absurdity of life. And that is a part of their filmmaking. It's a part of their conversations, and we try to adopt that as well as a filmmaking team. Plenty of absurdity in the process of making this film.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love that you have your little notes, like playing a little trill of, I think it was like Ennio Morricone maybe over some of the footage. And it got me thinking, like, man, I wonder if they ever had time just to go to the movies to keep up with like what was in theaters. But I'm so curious. Yeah, like you kind of referred to this idea of seeing this footage for the first time. I'm imagining like you two as filmmakers really getting your first glimpses at stuff like people in silver suits in front of a wall of flames, or people standing in lava that's like shooting fire all over their feet, or people holding giant turnips. And I'm like wondering, that almost feels like a gauntlet thrown. Like for you as filmmakers, were you ever in the back of your heads like, am I willing to really put my life on the line like that to get some of these shots?
You want to start? Yeah, it was endlessly baffling, the lengths that Katia and Maurice went to capture their imagery. There was imagery that, yeah, we had never seen before that felt so surreal, where we were just wondering, how did they capture this? And then we'd read about how they captured it. I should mention, aside from the hundreds of hours of footage that they took, they wrote nearly 20 books. And those were instrumental for us in really kind of understanding the play-by-play of how they got the footage, where they went, who they went there with. And they just went to absolutely extraordinary lengths. But I think being a documentary filmmaker, I personally feel like I have my absolute dream job. And I understand that just intoxicating quality of when you're in a place that's just full of, that transcendent beauty, you can't help but kind of surrender and go forth. And I wouldn't say that I haven't experienced the same kind of danger or adrenaline rush that Katia and Maurice perhaps had at the lip of a crater. But I do understand what it feels like to just so be immersed and to just follow. So I feel like there's a lot that we can learn as filmmakers from Katia and Maurice, and the boldness that they employed to kind of pursue their quest for knowledge and also capturing imagery.
Yeah, and I think the larger lesson is they did what they had to do to live the life that they had to live, and their life had to be as volcanologists traveling to the edge of the abyss. Ours is a little bit different as filmmakers, and maybe in our current moments, but I feel committed to that pursuit in a different way. And I know that this is a conversation we had with our other, two core collaborators, our editors, Aaron Casper and Jocelyn Chaput, and our other producer, Ina Fitchman. I think all of us recognize that if we were going to make this movie about Maurice and Katia, we had to sort of live the life in a way, even though that looks radically different.
But what parts of the story were missing for you guys? Because you also, it looks like, take the time to shoot outside footage, to shoot, overhead shots of coffee cups, to create like animations of how earth plates move, of tectonics. Like, how did you guys go about, because this is a very small team, as you said, that put this together, coming up with where you needed to step in and say what they hadn't had a chance to say?
That's a really good question. For us, it was always, we wanted the unknowns to also have their own space and to be articulated as unknowns that we could never answer nor ever attempt to film. That was really important to first just pay homage to the process, because Katia and Maurice died, 30 years before we ever began working on this project. And no matter how much research we did, no matter how many people we talked to who knew them, who lived with them, there was still those questions that we could never directly ask them. There's, of course, the great unknown that are volcanoes and the unknowns of the human heart. So it was essential to preserve that theme without trying to paper over it too much, to presume that we had all the answers. We certainly didn't. That said, there was some tones and feelings and imagery that we did think could help kind of almost articulate what we didn't have. The coffee cups, of course, were some of them trying to kind of be playful with the story of how they came together. But we were really excited to actually embrace the idea of a collage film, and specifically the collection of imagery that Katia and Maurice themselves accumulated. They had thousands and thousands of scientific illustrations of volcanoes dating back, I believe, to almost the 14th century. And we used those images as kind of the inspiration for our animation. So it was kind of like a nod to this other archival layer that at once could kind of play with the whimsy and the feeling of falling in love, but a specific falling in love over books, which is how they met. So those kinds of pieces help to fill in some of the gaps and shape the kind of rise and fall as well as the tone of their story. But hopefully not in a way that felt like we were trying to draw a bridge over the unknown. But yeah, what would you say?
Did you wrestle with telling the audience that they died at the beginning rather than sort of building to it at the end?
It was actually pretty early on that we made that decision. I think it was in our second cut. We decided to say that tomorrow will be their last day. There was a few reasons for that. First, we thought that if we didn't spell it out, that the audience would always be wondering, are they going to die here? Is this when it happens? Do they die? Do they live? And we wanted to kind of clear out that narrative space so you could really instead focus on how they lived, because that's really what this film is about, is the rich kind of meaningful life of Katia and Maurice Krafft. Time is also a major theme in the film, the precarity of a human life set against geologic time. And so we thought that if we set kind of a human clock early on, it would kind of conjure kind of an elegiac quality that you knew that every second was meaningful. So those were some of the major considerations. We also didn't want their death to be sensationalized in any kind of way. It in our minds, if it was kind of a third act twist, it would have felt a bit disrespectful and perhaps over-dramatized. And the fact that for them, death was such a part of their life, it didn't feel true to them either. Like there was always an acknowledgement that death was omnipresent. So it seemed like it had to be kind of woven into the fabric of the film early on.
Yeah, and then I think just lastly, it helped us center the idea that when you die, the death is not the end. And I think if we were to set it up in another way, without putting death in the beginning, we would lose track of that, and then we would lose some of the themes that you were talking about initially, which is just that their pursuit of creating a myth that would outlive their human life. We may not access that point as clearly if we didn't start with death.
I mean, you make so many, I think, really fun and clever choices in setting the tone and kind of getting us all on board for this film. That's just to make it scientific and playful and full of heart at the same time. I mean, I do love your music, which is like, it goes rock and roll, pop ballads. I love the detail moment where you take the music underwater when we're watching a volcano explode underwater and you like make it kind of muffled. But the tonal choice that I think people really are so curious to hear about is like your collaboration with Miranda July in doing the narration. I mean, she was announced as your narrator, I think, right before the film went to Sundance, but I assume you'd already had her on board before that. The narration that you wrote was a collaborative process, I've heard, from everybody. How was it working with her to get that did you wind up writing any of the narration and kind of having her voice in mind? How did you direct her to deliver the narration in a style that you thought fit the film? And talking to her, filmmaker to filmmaker, like how did all of these pieces fit together?
Miranda actually came in pretty late in the process. She is an artist. For those of you who aren't familiar, well, first, how familiar are people with Miranda July? Raise your hand if you know her. So a lot of people, but not everybody. For those of you who don't know Miranda July, she's just a phenomenal multi-hyphenate artist. She's a performance artist. She's an actor. She's a novelist, a short story writer. She's a phenomenal Instagram where she does experimental dance, but she's truly talented in so many ways. And I feel like she particularly has this way of expressing kind of the strange and precarious beauty of what it means to be alive and in relationship with each other. So to be a narrator for a love story just was like a dream come true for us. It wasn't an immediate choice. We actually thought we would have a French narrator for a while, seeing as Katia and Maurice were French. But during a brainstorming session, her name came up and we're instantly like, yes, Miranda would be great. Part of that was in our collaborative writing process, we were trying to invoke kind of a tonal style that we were inspired by from French New Wave narrators, again, kind of taking the lead from Katia and Maurice. But we called it, between ourselves, Deadpan Curious. And our editor, Jocelyn, one of our editors, Jocelyn, she was voicing the narration, and she set this very kind of, it was at once monotone but playful, which I know feels oxymoronic to say that, but she did it. And what that did, the almost monotone sense allowed for a sense of space for Katia and Maurice's imagery and their own words to come into play. And it was really our goal to set up our writing as prompts, as questions, rather than declarative truths or rather facts about Katia and Maurice. But it was always an interplay to the very last day of adding and then taking away, adding a little bit more, and then really taking away the narration.
Yeah, and I think in general, the process of writing narration is you overwrite first. So we would write what we wanted the film to say, and the narrator would be telling you everything that we wanted the film to say. But then, as Sarah was saying, we realized that actually it was in the gaps and the interstices between understanding and meaning that the narrator would have the most profound articulation and enhancement of what you were seeing on screen with Katia and Maurice. And then Miranda was perfect at that. Like, as soon as we heard her voice, it was as if she was meant to play the role. And I think as soon as she saw the film, she realized too that she had a very busy schedule, and it was a no first. I'm not doing anything. But then understood that this was her voice, and this was a voice she could access and enliven.
Yeah, and just briefly to say about the collaborative process, she was amazing to work with. She was so open and brought so much of herself to the process. Once we did know she came on, which was probably around like late November, that's when we started. Or no, it was around late October actually. We recorded with her at the beginning of December of last year. We did begin to shape our writing a little bit more. We would say like, oh, how would Miranda say this? And specifically like the line about the killer turnip. That was like, oh yeah, we could totally hear Miranda say this. So we're going to go for this kind of out there line because it felt authentically Miranda. So things like that did help to focus the process. But she was incredibly open and very collaborative and really fun to work with when we did the recording with her.
I love that. And I think that's a good segue to hear from some of the voices in this room to see who has a question, who would like to be our first questionnaire. Yes, right there.
I was curious how you came to know them in the first place and came to their story.
Sure. So we first met Katia and Maurice in the last film we made together, which is a documentary entitled The Seer and the Unseen. That story follows an Icelandic woman named Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir, who is in communication with spirits of nature. We really think of that documentary as a magically real documentary, and we wanted the opening scene to be about the formation of Iceland, and Iceland is a volcanic island, so we thought archival footage of erupting volcanoes would do a good job of telling that story and kind of place it in a mythic kind of time. So we began researching archival footage of erupting volcanoes in Iceland, and that's how we first learned about Katia and Maurice, because not many people had done that. But it was really kind of once we learned about them as people, their imagery was spectacular, but once we found out, they're a married couple, they love each other, they're also in love with the earth, they're very philosophical and playful, that's when we thought, okay, maybe there's really a film here. But we actually kind of put that on hold. We were entertained by that, but we started making a completely different film after we finished The Seer and the Unseen, a verite film that was going to be shot in Siberia. But we were going to scout in April of 2020, and the world had other plans for us. And speaking of fate, perhaps, but yeah, and so that's when we thought we were really hungry to make work somehow, still in isolation and lockdown, and that's when we remembered, oh, there's this wonderful couple that had shot hundreds of hours of volcano footage. Wouldn't it be a meaningful endeavor to try to access that and tell their story during this time? So that's what kicked it off.
Yes, right there.
Two questions. One, what academic degrees do they have, and did they design their own outfits, or did they have some manufacturing company? I mean, some looked more professional than others and had some logos on them.
So their academic degrees, Katia was a geochemist and Maurice was a geologist. Master's degrees, yeah. I believe Katia was a master's student actually when she met Maurice. But yeah, they were very much kind of higher education. They never wanted to be professors though. That was something that they discussed, and always wanted to be field scientists. So that's kind of why they did publish a fair amount though, but they weren't considered academics in that kind of more traditional sense. In terms of their suits, I believe that they did design a lot of their suits, or contributed to the understanding of how to build those. They're inspired by firefighters. Suits. It took a really long time, though. At first there was more of the deep sea diver kind of metal helmets that then became asbestos suits later on that really enabled them to get closer. But they were very much considered pioneers in kind of building the gear and especially the protective wear. And it was really that desire to get closer than many people had before that drove that innovative process. Is there any more that?
No, just that if there are any designers in the house tonight, we're looking for our suits as well. So if anyone can help
Halloween's
out.
coming up.
Yes, right here. The question is about the sound of the film and the eruptions being so immersive and how that all came together.
So yeah, that's a great question, one that we really love talking about. As I mentioned, the 16 millimeter footage that they shot did not have sync sound, which was very difficult for us because sound, of course, is such an essential part of making a film. Our editors, Aaron Casper and Jocelyn Chaput, went to painstaking lengths to really research volcano sounds and work with geothermal and volcano sound libraries in actually building these soundscapes. It was important to them to be scientifically accurate. And at the same time, the fact that there wasn't sound kind of opened up a space too for subjective play. Again, like Katia and Maurice, we always wanted to start with them and what felt like the most true and the most real to their experience. And they would often talk about volcanoes as like beasts, as monsters, as alive. And so because of that, we wanted to bring that feeling of sentience to the sound design as well. And just one little anecdote I like to share is that in the scene in Indonesia in 1979, when they go to the Anak Krakatau volcano, Aaron was experimenting with putting dinosaur sounds actually in with the eruptions, the explosions. It was very subtle. It's not like you felt like there was a snarling T-Rex at the base of the mountain at all, but you could perceive kind of like a hint of monstrosity there. And for us, that felt in line with how they perceived volcanoes. And so there was like the real, the factual, the scientific, and at once the subjective experience. And getting to play with that was such a joy for us. We then worked with an amazing sound team based in Montreal, a sound designer named Patrice Leblanc, who was able to take what Aaron and Jocelyn did and kind of elevated it and went through a fully designed process too. And then we had a re-recording mixer named Gavin Fernandez, who was just absolutely brilliant. And he especially played with kind of not just the volume and the bombasticity of the sound, but also the directionality, and was able to do things like in the scene in Mount Augustine in 1986, where the pyroclastic flow for the first time, that they're capturing, like he created this powerful sense of directionality where with the sound is concentrated in the middle channel, so you really kind of feel it coming towards you. So there's such creativity that working with this wonderful team afforded us. So yeah, it was really a joy.
I have bad news and good news. The bad news is that we've run out of time for more audience questions, but the good news is that there is a reception waiting downstairs, drinks, wine, alcohol, I believe even pizza, and these lovely people milling around to be talked to more about this wonderful film. First, I want to thank all of you for being here to see Fire of Love tonight. Tell everybody they have to see this amazing film. And please join me in thanking Sarah and Shane for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, IDA, for having us. This is really special for us.